Good evening. On behalf of my community, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Dr. Margaret Pfeil on a spirituality of nonviolence. Whether you are participating in person from our chapel or virtually via Zoom, we are grateful that you have chosen to make this event of our annual Learning Festival a part of your evening. We would like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. One need only to scan the day's headlines or to watch the evening news to know that our world is beset by violence in its myriad forms. Against the backdrop of our violent time, I think it is fair to say that we are all in need of continued formation around nonviolence and of a broader community who is committed to nonviolent living. Those who know Dr. Pfeil know that any introduction of the typical sort you might hear at a lecture would not do justice to her being and doing in this world. Nonetheless, in the spirit of getting acquainted with each other, allow me to offer these few words of introduction. Dr. Pfeil holds a joint appointment in the theology department and in the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame, where she is also a faculty fellow of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Clow Institute for Civil and Human Rights, and the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Her research interests include Catholic social thought, racial justice, ecological ethics, ecumenical dialogue, and peace studies. She has co-authored and co-edited several books, as well as numerous articles. Those of you who participated in the last year's Learning Festival will recall that she contributed a chapter on impasse and climate crisis, a contemplative view, for the book Desire, Darkness, and Hope, Theology in a Time of Impasse, a book which engaged the thought of our sister Connie. Dr. Pfeil is also the co-founder of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker Community in South Bend, Indiana, where she and her husband Robert reside. In addition to their work together at the Catholic Worker, Dr. Pfeil and her husband are also involved in an ecumenical dialogue group between Catholics and Mennonites called Bridgefolk. A fun little piece of trivia about Dr. Pfeil. She is a formerly licensed pilot. We are so very grateful to Dr. Pfeil for her presence among us this evening. So without further delay, please help me to welcome Dr. Margaret Pfeil.
Thank you so much, Sister Monica. And I just would like to say that it's really an honor to be here tonight. I have long admired this community and the work of Sister Connie, and I'm just so grateful for the witness of peace that you all have given through your lives here in community. So it's really a great honor to be with you and to share in this contemplation together about what a spirituality of nonviolence might mean and look like in our own time. I'd like to begin with just a small ritual, reading something from Glenn Stassen's book called Living the Sermon on the Mount. Glenn Stassen was a scripture and ethics scholar. And I remember talking to him at a conference at Notre Dame when he was working on this book, and he took out a napkin at lunch and sketched out the meaning of the Beatitudes. And I'll say more about it in the talk itself, but you'll notice that it's not your typical rendering of the Beatitudes. So let's just take a moment to gather ourselves and remember that we are in God's presence. Joyful are those who are poor and humble before God, for theirs is the reign of God. Joyful are those who are deeply saddened to the point of action, for they will be comforted. Joyful are those whose wills are surrendered to God, for they will inherit the earth. Joyful are those who hunger and thirst for restorative justice, for they will be filled. Joyful are those who practice compassion in action, for they will receive God's compassion. Joyful are those who seek God's will in all that they are and do, for they will see God. Joyful are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Joyful are those who suffer because of restorative justice, for theirs is the reign of God. And joyful are you when they criticize, persecute, and slander you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you. Amen. I wanted to read that because in his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis featured the Beatitudes. And in that peace message titled "Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace," he began by noting a troubling sign of our times. Quote, "Today, sadly, we find ourselves engaged in a horrifying world war fought piecemeal. It is not easy to know if our world is presently more or less violent than in the past, or to know whether modern means of communications and greater mobility have made us more aware of violence, or, on the other hand, increasingly inured to it." Unquote. He invited all of us to go deeper, looking inside ourselves for the roots of violence. Quote, "Jesus taught that the true battlefield where violence and peace meet is the human heart. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come." Mark 7:21. But Christ's message in this regard offers a radically positive approach. He unfailingly preached God's unconditional love, which welcomes and forgives. He taught his disciples to love their enemies, Matthew 5:44, and to turn the other cheek, Matthew 5:39. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, and when on the night before he died, he told Peter to put away his sword, Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. He walked that path to the very end, to the cross, whereby he became our peace and put an end to hostility. Whoever accepts the good news of Jesus is able to acknowledge the violence within and be healed by God's mercy, becoming in turn an instrument of reconciliation. In the words of St. Francis of Assisi, "As you announce peace with your mouth, make sure that you have greater peace in your hearts." Unquote. During our time together this evening, I'd like to explore the interior contours of active nonviolence as a way of life, a spiritual process of continuous conversion through which, by grace, God, who is love, disarms the fear underlying thoughts and acts of violence in their various forms. Perhaps this can be an opportunity for each of us to notice whether there are any strands of fear within, and to explore if there might be a particular habitual practice of active nonviolence that, through grace, can help us cooperate with God's love in disarming the forces of violence within our hearts. So just invite you now to take a moment in silence to notice any fears that may be surfacing within or that you might be aware of this evening. Dorothy Day, in her own practice, contemplated 1 John 4:18, which says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." And she said, well, that's true, but we have to get close enough to love. And reflecting on this insight in the context of our Catholic worker community, I used to think immediately of other people or situations that I needed to close distance with in order to allow God's love to dispel fear. And slowly, that reflective process has revealed that really the greatest impasse is within my own heart. Do I trust God, who is love, to disarm the fear within by finally saying yes, surrendering to God's love without conditions, caveats, or exceptions? And who is the person that I find most difficult to love? And how am I called to be in right relationship with them? We don't often speak of real enemies, but I suspect that if I did so, global geopolitical figures would not come first to mind, but rather those I encounter or perhaps find most difficult to encounter each day. So I'll invite you to take another moment in silence now and notice if any particular person or group comes to mind as maybe more challenging to love. Therese of Lisieux's little way of love was a powerful inspiration to Dorothy Day as she negotiated the gritty reality of the Catholic worker and asked questions just like the one that we were just contemplating. She was striving to practice active nonviolence as a way of life. Therese, Dorothy wrote, quote, "Practiced the presence of God, and she did all things, all the little things that make up our daily life and contact with others for his honor and glory. When the whole world seems given over to preparedness for war and the show of force, the message of Therese is quite a different one. She speaks to our condition. Is the atom a little thing? And yet what havoc it has wrought. Is her little way a small contribution to the life of the Spirit? It has all the power of Christianity behind it. It is an explosive force that can transform our lives and the life of the world once put into effect." Unquote. Therese and Dorothy Day herself model what a spirituality of active nonviolence can look like in practice. For each of us, it will take a different shape depending on how God draws us in the particular circumstances of our lives and the particular charisms given us by the Holy Spirit. But whatever the situation at hand, active nonviolence is a way of life, a way of being in the world. It involves cultivating habitual dispositions directed toward God in love, no matter what form of hatred or violence we may face. For followers of Jesus, this means embracing the nonviolent cross, returning love in the face of hatred. Jesus interrupted the cycle of violence once and for all through his life, death, and resurrection. In each Eucharistic celebration, we remember God's no to violence enfleshed in Jesus, and we receive Jesus's gift of peace as the people of God. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis notes that Jesus offers a sort of field manual in the Sermon on the Mount for the practice of active nonviolent peacemaking. The Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 1-12, quote, provide a portrait of the person we could describe as blessed, good, and authentic, unquote. So in our opening this evening, I shared with you, we prayed with this less common version of the Beatitudes, in which Glenn Stassen uses an interpretation of the word joyful from the Greek makarioi. And in the New Testament context, makarioi, Stassen writes, almost always means the joy of participation in God's act of deliverance. And the Beatitudes speak to disciples who are already being made participants in the presence of the Holy Spirit through Jesus Christ. Through Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, the reign of God is already among us. And Jesus invites his disciples to live into the reality of his reign joyfully, guided by the Spirit. So this evening, I'm inviting you to consider active nonviolence through this beatitudinal lens of joy, not only as a theological question, but a visceral experience of joy. I think the Beatitudes offer both promise of future blessing and God's outpouring of love in the here and now, if only we give ourselves over to God in the moment. Joy connotes contemplative awareness, a transparent and unself-conscious quality of presence. Joy centers the heart's desire on God. So again, I invite you to take a brief moment in silence to recall a specific experience of joy. What do you remember about it? Now, keeping that memory in mind, imagine bringing that same fullness of presence to bear in a situation that calls for God's merciful and compassionate love. Stassen also notes the direct parallel between the Beatitudes, Isaiah 61, and Jesus's first public preaching in Luke 4:18. The presence of the Holy Spirit marks each passage, pointing to the qualities of discipleship Jesus is seeking to cultivate in his followers by enfleshing them himself. Anointed by the Spirit, Jesus brings good news to the poor, proclaims release from bondage, comforts those who mourn, heals the brokenhearted, upholds righteousness, and perseveres joyfully in the face of persecution. The first and third Beatitudes use the Greek word praeus, and often it is translated as meek. Stassen points out that wherever this word appears in the Bible, quote, it always points to peacefulness or peacemaking, unquote. The third Beatitude follows closely from Psalm 37:11, which says, "But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy great peace." The whole of Psalm 37 speaks to the qualities associated with the reign of God that Jesus preaches, a reign characterized by Christ's gift of peace. The fullness of Christ's peace, shalom, connotes right relationship with God, neighbor, and all of creation, not merely an absence of war. This connotation of peacemaking fits with another meaning that Clarence Jordan, founder of the Koinonia community in Georgia, ascribed to the word praeus. He preferred to render it as completely surrendered to the will of God. Jesus is the Messiah who claims his reign as prophesied, riding humbly and peacefully into Jerusalem. Jesus models what it means to be completely surrendered to God, which is the true meaning of spiritual poverty. As we see, for example, in Gustavo Gutierrez's work on the preferential option for the poor and the Latin American Bishops' 1968 document at Medellin, Colombia, in which they speak about voluntary poverty, material poverty, and spiritual poverty. Spiritual poverty as complete surrender springs from humility. From the Sermon on the Mount to the Rule of St. Benedict, from St. Francis and St. Clare onward to Teresa of Avila and Pope Francis's text on care for creation, Laudato Si, one can trace an emphasis on humility as an essential aspect of spiritual growth in general, as well as a spirituality of active nonviolence in particular. Martin Luther King Jr., I think, offers a powerful witness of true humility rooted in the surrender of spiritual poverty. The night before he was assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, King spoke of the mountaintop to a group of 1,300 African-American sanitation workers. Two of the workers, Etchell Cole and Robert Walker, had been crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. And this galvanized the movement to address and to advocate for a just wage and dignified working conditions over against pretty significant resistance from City Hall at that time in Memphis. Exhausted and facing death threats, King ended his speech with these words, quote, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." These words reflect a heart surrendered in the interior freedom of humility, ready to follow Jesus to the cross in the manner of Jesus himself, nonviolently. King could have chosen to accompany the striking workers from a safe distance. But his focus was not on his own personal safety and saving his own life, but rather living into the saving justice of Jesus's reign together in community with those workers as brothers and sisters, right there in the depth of their struggle. King's mountaintop speech manifests the work of God's grace. Precisely when the heart is broken and vulnerable, it becomes available for the power of God's love and joy to enter in and fill it. That night, King said to the workers, quote, "I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars," unquote. He situated the dark night of the Memphis workers in the context of the whole civil rights movement. And here we can remember Sassen's rendering of the Beatitude of mourning. "Joyful are those saddened to the point of action, for they will be comforted." King and the Memphis sanitation workers practiced beatitudinal mourning, lamenting the violent and systemic dehumanization wrought by white supremacy and resisting it through nonviolent action for justice as children of God. Again, quoting from King's speech, "Now we're going to march again, and we've got to march again in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be and force everybody to see that there are 1,300 of God's children here suffering, sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights, wondering how this thing is going to come out. That's the issue. And we've got to say to the nation, we know it's coming out. For when people get caught up with that which is right, and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory." Unquote. King spoke from a place of deep spiritual liberation, allowing God, who is love, to disarm fear. And he was willing to sacrifice even his life for the justice of communal right relationship, knowing that more persecution would follow. Here, I think the trajectory of the Beatitudes is clear. Those seeking to practice justice from a heart liberated by love, in order to love fully, will strive to share Christ's peace, especially where it is most needed, hungering and thirsting for righteousness or right relationship, restorative justice of the reign of God. It is a process, a journey of discipleship undertaken by followers of Jesus, contending constantly with our own sinfulness, limitations, and fragility. So I invite you once again to take a moment in silence and notice what you may be lamenting. What circumstances in your own life might sadden you to the point of compassionate action? King said, "It is in the depth of darkness that we can see the stars." And I think that that light reveals truth within us. In lament, one learns where the bottom of one's interior resources really is. It is precisely this limit experience that yields a merciful response and compassionate action, the work of peace. Without the experience of suffering, without coming up against our own limits, we might never know our capacity to grow in love of God and compassion for one another. St. Francis addressed this revelatory quality of the limit experience. Among the 28 admonitions or directives that he passed along to his brothers, several directly invoke the Beatitudes. The 13th is on patience and peacemaking. Quote, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." The servant of God cannot know how much patience and humility he has within himself as long as everything goes well with him. But when the time comes in which those who should do him justice do quite the opposite to him, he has only as much patience and humility as he has on that occasion, and no more. Unquote. Every time I read that, I am caught up short, because I certainly think about all the times that I think, oh boy, I think I'm getting somewhere with patience and humility. And then something happens and I realize, oh, no, I don't have that at all. A person who did have it was Father Christian de Chauget, who was prior of the Cistercian community at Our Lady of Atlas Monastery in Tiberine, Algeria. He forged patient humility through the limit experience of intense armed conflict. In his diocesan retreat talk in early March 1996, Father Christian identified patience as one of 5 pillars of peace. The rule of Saint Benedict, which his community follows, counsels patient perseverance in a monk's vocation until death. Chauget's monastic community was facing an increasingly volatile situation in which their lives were threatened by an armed Muslim faction, even as they were living peaceably within a majority Muslim community in Tiberine, who loved the monks as their own family. Over against advice from the French government, some of their own family members, and other religious, they chose to remain in Algeria. Poverty of spirit was Father Christian's second pillar of peace, opening onto the third, attentiveness to God's presence in each moment, and each person made imago Dei. Taking the life of another, Father Christian said, is to kill the image of God. Quote, "The first words a person's face says to another is, 'Respect me.' Killing can take different forms, as all who live in a community know. A contemptuous attitude, a wounding word, phrases that assassinate are other ways to kill." Unquote. Formed deeply in interreligious dialogue, he regarded as his neighbor and brother Saya Atia, the leader of the militant faction that violently raided his monastery on Christmas 1993, demanding medical attention for wounded members of their group. Father Christian's response was to pray for him, his fourth pillar of peace. Quote, "After the episode with Atia, I wanted to pray for him. What should I pray? Kill him? No, but I could pray, disarm him. But then I asked myself, do I have the right to ask God to disarm him if I don't begin by asking, disarm me, disarm my brothers?" That was my prayer each day. Unquote. The final pillar of peace, he said, is forgiveness, quoting from the Lord's Prayer from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:9-14. Jesus' distillation of beatitudinal mercy, God's compassion in action. And knowing the great danger his community faced, Father Christian prepared a letter to be read in the event of his death. After he and 6 other fellow monks were abducted later that same month in March 1996 and were killed shortly thereafter, his letter was published in the local newspapers. In it, he attempted to disarm any desire for retribution or scapegoating of Muslim Algerians, and he urged forgiveness. His final words were addressed to his would-be assassin, quote, "And to you too, my friend of the last moment, who will not know what you are doing. Yes, for you too, I wish this thank you, this adieu, whose image is in you also, that we may meet in heaven like happy thieves, if it pleases God, our common Father. Amen, inshallah," unquote. Father Christian's witness was dismissed as naive by some wounded by the ways of the world. But seen through a beatitudinal lens, the clarity and peace of his heart before God shine brightly. Joyful are those who seek God's will in all that they are and do, for they will see God. The Beatitude on Purity of Heart. Look for the unity of inward roots and outward fruits, Stassen suggests. A seamless coherence between one's interior life and one's actions. This involves not so much purity as integrity or single-minded focus on God. Thomas Merton observed that humility and integrity are almost the same thing. Both involve a clear-sighted and undivided contemplative focus on Jesus. I also hear a resonance of this humble wholeness in Carmelite Sister Vilma Selas's emphasis on the inseparability of detachment and humility in her reading of Teresa's Way of Perfection. Detachment from that which is not of God, whether things, relationships, situations, leads to what she calls, quote, clarity of vision to be creatively present to peace, unquote. Creatively present to peace. This is characterized by right relationship. With a distilled spirit and quiet heart, one can rest and trust in God's love, making it possible to love others freely and fully. Detachment, Sister Vilma observes, enables us to surrender our being to what she calls the more of life, quote, to the transcendent being that is ourselves, pregnant with God, unquote. Imagine if we saw each other made in God's image and pregnant with God. How would that change our culture if that were the way of encounter? In the purifying process of inner and outer spiritual alignment, one may begin to notice the violence within and realize its outward correlates. Rosemary Lynch and Alain Richard advise as one of their practices of active nonviolence, quote, to recognize that what I resent and perhaps even detest in another person comes from my difficulty in admitting that this same reality lives also in me. To recognize and renounce my own violence, which becomes evident when I begin to monitor my words, gestures, reactions, unquote. So once again, I'll just ask if we could take a moment in silence to consider any experience in which you became aware that your discomfort with another person's behavior connected with some tendency in yourself. Once we become contemplatively aware of such tendencies, it's possible to address them and turn them over to God in love and ask for God's help in prayer. I think this is an essential part of a spirituality of active nonviolence. A related practice is to notice and address thoughts and feelings that disturb peace within and without. In her book, Thoughts Matter, Benedictine sister Mary Margaret Pfeil recalls the story of Abba Anthony, the Desert Father. Having renounced his possessions, status, and relationships to take up the eremitic life, he discovered that these were all present in his thoughts. Quote, rather than moving into a mystical experience with God, his mind kept his previous life before him. He had a second renunciation to undergo. He realized that his thoughts mattered and that they had to be taken seriously, unquote, because they kept him from praying. So where do my thoughts go? I think it's a powerful spiritual practice to become attentive to this question and to cultivate positive habits of focusing the attention mindfully on that of God. In the rule of Saint Benedict, the practice of becoming aware of one's thoughts is the first of 12 steps of humility. And Funk writes of that step, quote, to be attentive to God's presence is to listen, to pray, to lift up our hearts to God and lay aside our ever-present inner chatter, unquote. In a course I teach called the Beatitudes of Nonviolence that Bridget and I were once part of together, students are invited to adopt a spiritual discipline of nonviolence for the semester. And that happens to be long enough to cultivate a habit. And many have chosen to abstain from technology in some particular way. And one year, one student chose to forego use of his phone as he was walking from place to place on campus. And he realized he was noticing things like budding trees and wildlife, the squirrels going after people's food, and the fact that the flowers changed by season. And the list went on and on as he was writing about this through the semester. But then one day he sat down on a bench and his friends saw him and they stopped. They were worried about him and they said, are you sick? And he said, no, it's a beautiful day. I'm just sitting here. Do you want to join me? Oh, no, we don't have time to sit down, but we were just wondering why you were sitting. And he wrote in his reflection that he was both amused and sobered by that. And that their reaction was really a wake-up call for him. He realized that his whole thought life, his conscious awareness had been consumed by input from smart devices, and that his habit was part of a much broader culture, really a way of being. And he noted also within himself various layers of violence that found outward expression. I'll just say something that I wanted to include. This morning, I got a text, an email from a student who's studying abroad who took this class last year. And she said it just happened to be today that she sent this message. And I thought, oh, I should mention this. She said that she is in a living situation where she needs to wash the dishes by hand. And that's not her custom. And she remembered talking about it in our course. And she said now that she's doing it, she realized how frustrating she found it at the beginning. And as she gave herself over to it, because that's the only alternative, she's doing that for the next few months, forming this habit. She said that she realized that she was finding a place of interior calm in the process. And she was beginning to look forward to washing the dishes now. And I thought, oh, that's just what we're going to be talking about tonight together. I think what calls my attention in her account is she's aware of the emotions that are shifting within her as she undertakes this practice. And once again, like the other student, is becoming aware of what's within that has to be addressed. That where's that frustration coming from? Where's the impatience rooted? So I think becoming aware of emotions that disturb peace is also a valuable practice of active nonviolence. I think emotions present an opportunity to notice what may be happening interiorly. Where are they rooted? Bless you. Both Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh have addressed the practice of channeling the generative power of anger to focus on one particular emotion. It is like heating a pot of potatoes, Thich Nhat Hanh suggests, putting the lid of our concentration on the pot and letting that come to a boil. Giving ourselves time through the practice of mindful breathing to come to awareness about the source of the anger can open the way toward compassionate, mindful action to address its roots. The potatoes are cooked, the anger is transformed, and understanding can guide action. So I'll invite you once again to just take a moment to notice what thoughts and emotions would benefit from sustained attention as part of cultivating peace within and without. So, in her study of St. Teresa's work, Sister Vilma emphasized, quote, personal spiritual growth is inevitably channeled into societal health, unquote. She sees in Teresa's experience a process of deepening consciousness of God with Christ, with prayer at the heart of peacemaking. And she notices in Teresa's way of perfection that Teresa's struggling, wanting to be more active in the world as a peacemaker, and then comes to see that, oh, actually, the prayer of the community is peacemaking. It is a way of affecting peace. And we can consider Teresa in her own time. As we think about our own time now, though, is there something there for us to consider? In Teresa's time, this entailed ordering monastic life in right relationship. So dispensing with honorific titles and status, and instead referring all honor to Christ, advocating for women's right to pray contemplatively in the context of 16th century Spain. These were ways of effecting Christ's peace. So in our own time and place, a spirituality of active nonviolence invites us to face the particular conflicts of our time, allowing ourselves to notice interiorly what they might reveal about our own fear and attachments. In the process, little by little, through contemplative awareness, God draws us to God's self personally and communally. Cultural transformation toward right relationship can slowly emerge. This will entail suffering and persecution, in which the spiritual discipline of returning love in the face of hatred is forged. We think of the examples that I referred to tonight, and you probably can think of other examples as well, of witnesses to active nonviolence who were able to return love in the face of hate out of a place of suffering. And some people may ask, well, but does it work? Is it effective in stopping violence? And I think that's a very important question. Surprisingly, there are good data showing that active nonviolence has worked over half the time where it has been employed over the last century or so. And Jean Sharp's work demonstrates numerous historical examples of successful active nonviolent resistance. In the end, though, I think a spirituality of active nonviolence does not depend on strategic success. The integrity of the witness, rooted in love of God and neighbor, has value in itself. I think, for example, of Mennonite brethren who are Ukrainian, who right now are living in the area of Kherson and Zaporizhia and have chosen to stay and provide aid to practice the works of mercy, not bearing arms, and accompanying people, providing aid. And that is their way of living out their creedal commitment to nonviolence. It's a way of life for them. The integrity of the witness, rooted in love of God and neighbor, has value in itself. Christians follow a person who was crucified and by all appearance seem to have failed by the measure of the world. In the Beatitudes, as well as the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught and modeled a spirituality of nonviolence, a way of true interior liberation in and through God who is love. This is the way of God's reign, which Jesus has already begun within each of us and among us as the people of God and in our world. So, thank you. And we thought that it might be helpful just to get the blood flowing and the thoughts percolating, to talk in small groups. So I'll invite you to discuss with one another in small groups if there might be a particular spiritual discipline of active nonviolence that you could consider adopting. And also, please just take the opportunity to talk in general about whatever may be stirring in your heart as you consider a spirituality of nonviolence. And then we'll come back for a plenary discussion. All right, I'll just say again, for those participating by Zoom, please use the raise hand function, which can be found in the reactions tab. And if you prefer, you can send in your question using the Zoom chat and we will read it for you. So maybe we could begin here in the room. If there's anybody who would like to share a little bit about what you discussed in your small groups, or whatever you would like to say really is fine.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for this talk tonight. It was interesting hearing what you had to say, and also from coming all the way from South Bend to out here to Legacy. It's quite a trip. We only had to go a little ways and came all this way. So what I was sharing with my group is how do you put into action a little bit more definitively something like what we see violence around here, like in Baltimore City, for instance, which is probably the closest where you see violence taking place almost daily, clearly shooting every day. How is me in practicing this spiritual nonviolence able to engage this a little bit more and make some kind of a difference, short of going in there and doing the sorts of things that Dr. King did, and leading groups of people in a nonviolent way?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a big question. We could talk the rest of the night about that. And I don't have an easy answer, but I will say that I was wanting to stress nonviolence as a way of life and a lens, a way of seeing the world and being in the world. Because once you make that commitment, as Jesus was inviting, options appear that otherwise might have been obscured and might not have been visible to you before. So people like the Mennonites, for example, who make a creedal commitment to nonviolence. I'll just say my husband is Mennonite, and so I have had many chances to observe the formation of children in the context of the Mennonite worship community. And from the time that they're born, they are formed in this way of seeing the world. So when they're in a particular situation like what you're describing, a whole panoply of options is present and emergent, because that's who they've been formed to be. And I'll say, as a cradle Catholic, I think I was in college before anyone ever spoke the word nonviolence to me, even though it's right here in the gospel. And that's why I was emphasizing the Sermon on the Mount and why Pope Francis pointed to it in his 2017 World Day of Peace message. That's not a short-term commitment. That's the commitment of, for us, a commitment of Christian discipleship. It's a lifelong journey that we're being invited into. And I don't mean to dodge your question. I hear what you're saying, and I think about our context in South Bend, and we have similar issues. I was watching the local news tonight at 5, and so I have some idea of what you're talking about. And one of the, I think we call it in South Bend a matrix for the police department to try to develop a different culture around policing in which people of color are not so much at risk as they often are when the first response is to get out a gun and shoot someone. There would be a whole array of options before use of force in what is called just policing. So de-escalation techniques, training, and we're developing a crisis response team in South Bend so that instead of sending the police for a mental health crisis, a team of people trained in mental health would encounter a person experiencing crisis, and then they would be able to go to a crisis response center dedicated to that purpose, rather than to the county jail, for example, where they're not equipped. Our sheriff has said many times, we're not equipped to deal with that. These are ways of thinking about how to disarm, as Father Charget said, disarm me, disarm my brother. The reason I was emphasizing the discipline of nonviolence is because unless I tend to those things in myself through, as a person of faith, through prayer, and bring that violence within me to God, I won't be able to approach the larger scale forms of violence. And the larger scale forms of violence will keep happening in our cities, in our world, as long as we don't take the chance to form ourselves in a disciplined way. If you think about the training that soldiers undergo, it's extremely rigorous. And I see it on campus, you know, the ROTC students, for example. It's unbelievably rigorous. They're out there, if I go to campus early, they're out there finishing up their PT at 7 in the morning. They're done already. And imagine if we put even a 1/10 of that dedication into forming ourselves in the way of nonviolence as a gospel commitment. In our Catholic worker community, we ask this question every day. What you're describing is exactly what we're facing, but we're committed to nonviolence, and it's not easy. It means that, you know, we have people who are dealing with pretty serious mental health issues who are on the cusp of doing harm to themselves and others. And our commitment is to encounter them as someone made in God's image who is deserving of respect. And that may be the first time in their lives that they've ever been encountered that way. And when people are encountered out of a place of respect and love, they respond well, almost always. But you have to be there. You've got to be there with them. And so I know the last part of your question was short of doing what King did. I don't know that we can do it short of what King did. I think that the one reason I wanted to point to his example and what he was doing when he was killed was organizing a poor people's campaign and making the connection between large-scale violence and war and the war on our streets and the economy, the systemic economic injustice that exacted this tremendous toll, particularly on the most vulnerable and particularly on Black Americans. And as a white American theologian, I need to look for places to put myself out there and figure out what it means to return love in the face of hate. And it may not be hate directed at me. It may be hate directed at people around me. I've got to be there. That's what the incarnation is really asking. So, boy, that may be annoyingly vague and it lacks specificity compared to what you were asking, which you were asking me for something specific, but sorry.
That your extra coat in the closet belongs to the poor. Think of all the extra things we have in our home. Okay. I grew up in Baltimore. I worked in Baltimore. I worshiped in Baltimore. We still live in Baltimore. You know, what creates that balance? I used to tell our children when we would ride out to visit friends and family in the suburbs, roll up your windows and lock the car because this is a dangerous neighborhood. And the reason why it's a dangerous neighborhood is because we don't care about how our lives affects those in the city. How many people would work for minimum wage and try to raise a family? How many people would live in what we call ghetto, the ugliness and the brokenness, and not come away with hatred and anger? It's our blindness on that macro level that we don't realize how we contribute by having those extra coats, by not being willing. How many people want to pay their taxes? And the taxes are there. That's one way we help eliminate a lot of child poverty this time around with the money going from the federal government. So we got to look at not only what does that inner city person need to do to change our lives, but what we need to do that creates that picture there in the first place. Why America, the most powerful, wealthiest nation on earth, has the poverty that it has is sinful. And it needs to be named as sinful. And when we turn our eyes to the plight of people, it needs to be named as sinful.
Thank you.
I, again, also wish to express a lot of appreciation for the lecture that was given, but I want to ask something a little offbeat to try to make it a little more accessible to myself. And that is, do you think that Jesus of Nazareth had the option to be violent and chose nonviolence in lieu of violence? Because I don't think he did. I think he lived in a society where he was in the victim class. Of course, he was killed. So I'm trying to just ask that question. What is it about Jesus that makes you think that we could, like, how is it that we're following him if he didn't really have a choice to be nonviolent? And the flip side of that is, are we really coming from a position of privilege? We have a choice to be nonviolent or not. And I'll leave it with that and see what that evokes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. You know, Pope Francis in his World Day of Peace message talked about Jesus telling Peter to put away his sword. And Peter certainly felt like he had a choice and exercised that choice. And Jesus was saying, no, not that way. That comes to mind. I think another thing that your question evokes for me is right after the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:38-42, he's offering these three examples that I think the community will be considering together tomorrow. But turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. If asked to give your cloak, give your undergarment as well. And Walter Wink's interpretation and Barbara Reed, president of CTU, both point to the kind of the subversive quality of that. It's possible to read that passage and notice what Jesus is doing. He's encountering the mores of the time, but then subverting exactly that structure of oppression by saying, well, go the extra mile. And in that context, Roman legion soldiers were only allowed to force someone to carry their pack for exactly 1 mile and not more. And if they carried it more, then they would be punished. And Wink says, well, in that moment, when a person has been forced to carry it 1 mile and says, oh, let me carry it an extra one, in that moment, Wink says there's an opportunity maybe for the person who is oppressing to realize the humanity of the person being oppressed. And it serves the dignity of both parties, both the person oppressed and the oppressor. There's an opportunity for conversion in that moment. And I think about the nonviolent disciplines of the civil rights movement, I think that James Lawson and the students in Nashville used a very similar approach to occupy the lunch counters in 1960 and fill them and accept the abuse and be taken away to jail with the idea of filling the jail, and to have the opportunity for the whole system, not just one or two people, but the whole system, to be forced to realize, oh, what are we doing? These are human beings. And Diane Nash, just a powerful movement. You think about it, she was an undergraduate student in Nashville, and she confronted the mayor of Nashville and asked him point blank, well, do you believe that we ought to have equal rights as human beings, that we ought to be served at the lunch counter and be able to, is this a question of human dignity? And he said, yes, as a person of conscience, yes, I do believe that. And it was with that, the businesses needed to desegregate and serve everyone. I mean, of course, it was a process, but that was a watershed moment. And it's very similar to what Jesus is doing in this interpretation of Matthew 5:38 to 42. All that to say, the question of choice, Jesus as incarnate, human and divine. I think we can't know this side of the eschaton, the depth of God's love for God's own creation. Jesus did know that. And in that way, I don't believe theologically that violence against another human being would ever have been a real choice. What he was inviting us to see as human beings is that it ought not ever to be a real choice for us either. If we really understand the depth of God's love for God's own creation, and not just for human life, but for all of creation. So thinking about the fact of our interconnection. We didn't talk about Laudato Si much tonight, but that is part of it. If we think about right relationship with God, neighbor, and all of creation. I hope that gets to the question.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you to the Carmelites for hosting this and for everybody here. While I'm listening to everybody tonight, I'm reminded of an unusual first event that I encountered here in Baltimore when I came, which was going on one of Bishop Madden's peace walks. And I think COVID has stopped them. I don't think they've started up again, but they were walks that he and I guess a group of people organized through some of the most violent neighborhoods in Baltimore. And they stopped and told stories of the people that were, I think most of them were murdered in Baltimore, of all kinds of ages. And the thing that meant the most to me is that many of the people who went on the march might not have, or the walk didn't finish the walk, because they were talking to the neighbors in that neighborhood about what goes on in the neighborhood and educating people on the walk about their needs and their wants and their hopes. And I just wanted to mention that as a really positive display of bringing communities together and building more trust with one another.
Thanks so much for sharing that. That's a wonderful example of a practice of active nonviolence and building relationship and remembering the fact of our interconnection in community. And to go back to what you were saying earlier about the connection between the systemic violence of economic injustice and racial injustice, and how we're called to respond nonviolently in that context, to reweave parts of society that have been sundered through privilege. And that was the other question that the person raised, the question of privilege. If it is a privilege we have to choose, I think we are invited to confront the divisions that necessitate a peace walk in order for us to meet and to disarm the fear. If we take that approach, I think this issue of privilege, is there a privilege in choosing violence or nonviolence? I think much like Jesus, maybe we would find ourselves realizing that, actually, there isn't a choice in the end. It's only about nonviolence, growing into the love of God together. And God deeply desires us to come back together. How do we cooperate with that? Well, I think we may be at the end.
So once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Pfeil for being here and for giving us so much to think and to pray about. And thanks to all of you for joining us, whether you're here in our chapel or joining us online. If it's your first time with us, please do come back, look at our website, and join us again. We'd love to have you. Maybe we could close with a prayer. Dear God, thank you for all creation. In the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth and all the teachers of peace who inspire the many faith traditions, help us and all the people of the world learn how to replace hate, war, oppression, and division with love, peace, freedom, and reconciliation. Help us to embody your love in our relationships with our family and friends, strangers, even our enemies. We commit ourselves to this sacred task throughout our lives. So let it be. Amen.